Sith were always a pain in the ass for everyone in Star Wars. That's true. For over 5,000 years, they controlled galactic events, fought the Jedi, and left behind a history full of power, fear, and betrayal. In this video, we'll take a look at the entire history of the Sith, where they came from, how they got so powerful, and whether they were really all evil. So grab something to eat, get comfortable, and let the galaxy fade around you. And if you enjoy slow journeys through strange history, feel free to subscribe, it helps a lot. Now, let's begin. Before the Sith became the black-robed villains we see in the movies, they were something else entirely. The Sith didn't start out as corrupted Jedi. They didn't even wield lightsabers. In fact, they weren't even human. The Sith were a distinct species. Tall, red-skinned humanoids with cranial ridges, sharp facial features, and glowing yellow eyes. They were native to the harsh, dusty world of Korriban, a planet that practically oozed death from its sun-baked cliffs and endless graveyards. The air was dry and bitter, the sky often choked with storms. It wasn't paradise, but it was home. The Sith species had been evolving in isolation for millennia. They built a rigid, warrior-based culture where power was respected and worshipped. Authority came from strength, not birthright. Tribal kings rose and fell constantly, usually through violent duels or bloody civil conflict. The strongest ruled, the weak submitted. It was simply the natural order. It was how things had always been. But despite their aggressive society, the Sith had a deep spiritual culture rooted in mysticism, sorcery, and reverence for the dead. Their burial grounds were sacred places, and entire generations of Sith kings were entombed beneath towering pyramids carved into the Korriban cliffs. These weren't simple graves either. They were filled with traps, illusions, and ancient relics designed to guard the spirits of the departed, or possibly to keep them from returning. So, for them, death wasn't an end. And that belief ran deep. The Sith believed that certain rulers could transcend death entirely. The spirits of the most powerful were said to linger in their tombs, whispering secrets to those brave enough to listen. In their eyes, physical destruction was just another step toward an even greater form of power. Many of their kings actively sought to preserve their essence after death, and their tombs were built like machines, meant to channel, store, and even weaponize the echoes of their souls. This obsession with death. They were actually fascinated by what lay beyond it. Most Sith were born Force-sensitive to varying degrees, but their understanding of the Force was nothing like the Jedi's. For the Sith species, the Force was raw energy, a weapon, a force of will that could be bent, shaped, and used to dominate. They called it the Ka, and those who could command it were seen as chosen, gifted by the universe with the right to rule. And because their society was already centered on hierarchy and strength, the Ka was something to be flaunted. A Sith child who could crush a stone with their mind or sense danger before it arrived were marked as future leaders, given extra food, extra training, and sometimes entire families would offer themselves in service, hoping to gain favor when that child rose to power. The strongest of these Force wielders often became kings or warlords. Their society naturally elevated those with the Ka into positions of leadership. Unlike the Jedi, who feared power imbalance, the Sith leaned into it. If you could destroy your rivals, it meant you deserved to. If you could command the storms, bend beasts to your will, or rip the life from your enemies, then you had earned your place. It was brutal, but there was a strange kind of logic in it. You didn't apologize for your strength. You owned it. Their early magic was chaotic, a mix of Force manipulation, blood rituals, and symbology carved into bone and stone. They used talismans and primitive amulets to amplify their power. They weren't building Death Stars yet. They were painting caves with ancient glyphs, speaking incantations in forgotten tongues, and binding spirits to relics that would outlast their own bodies. Even their architecture reflected their values. They were harsh, angular, towering structures meant to intimidate. Every inch of stone told a story of conquest, of one ruler destroying another and claiming their place. The walls were carved with scenes of battle, sacrifice, and ascension. If you walked through a Sith fortress, you weren't supposed to feel peace. You were supposed to feel fear or ambition. What's maybe most fascinating about the ancient Sith is that their society had structure, codes, rituals, and an internal logic that made perfect sense to them. It's easy to call them evil through a Jedi lens, But that's not how they saw themselves. To them, the pursuit of power wasn't corruption, it was destiny. And perhaps that's why they lasted so long in isolation. For thousands of years, the Sith species thrived under these principles, forming empires, building bloodlines, and creating a society where strength was the only currency that mattered. Of course, isolation couldn't last forever. Eventually, outsiders arrived, explorers, missionaries, and most fatefully, exiles. And by exiles, I mean guys so-called Dark Jedi. But that name came later, probably invented by the winners, as most names are. At the time, these people thought they were visionaries, revolutionary thinkers. They weren't twirling moustaches in secret caves talking about how evil they were. They genuinely believed the Jedi Order had become stagnant, rigid, and frankly blind to the greater potential of the Force. The fracture that led to their exile is known as the 100-Year Darkness, which sounds like a death metal album, but was really a very slow, very philosophical, and very bloody conflict inside the Jedi Order. It started with debates. Could the Force be used to manipulate life itself? Could you drain another being's energy to heal your own wounds? Should Jedi limit themselves to passive defense? Or were they justified in pursuing knowledge, even dangerous knowledge, if it meant peace in the long run? A growing number of Jedi started experimenting with abilities the Order considered deeply unethical. One of the most controversial areas? Alchemy. These rogue Jedi had discovered ways to twist the Force into reshaping flesh, creating monstrous war beasts, enhancing their own bodies, and in some extreme cases, prolonging life far beyond natural limits. It didn't take long before words turned into lightsabers. The Jedi High Council tried to contain the problem, but as the rift grew, so did the number of followers. Jedi Knights and even Masters started walking away from the Order, openly rejecting its codes, forming splinter groups, and creating their own teachings. What followed was a slow-burning civil war, skirmishes on remote planets, entire temples breaking ranks. The final battles saw the last holdouts of the Dark Jedi surrounded, overwhelmed, and captured. Instead of executing them, the Jedi Council decided to exile them. They were loaded onto ships and launched into deep space, effectively a one-way ticket into oblivion. The official record said they'd never survive. They did. Their destination? Korriban, a remote, harsh desert world, completely off the radar of the Republic. The planet was already inhabited by a species called the Sith, as I said earlier. When the exiled Jedi arrived, it was awkward. Imagine a bunch of war criminals crash landing on a planet of ancient Force shamans. The Sith saw these new arrivals as gods. The Jedi's advanced technology, command of the Force, and lightsabers, which, by the way, looked like straight-up sorcery to the Sith, instantly elevated them to positions of power. And the exiles? They didn't mind the attention. This wasn't conquest, it was cultural absorption. The Dark Jedi didn't wipe out the Sith species. They ruled over them, married into them, taught them their Force philosophies, and adopted many of the Sith's own spiritual practices in return. Over time, the distinction between the two groups faded. The line between Sith, the people, and Sith, the ideology, began to blur. From these unions emerged a new Force tradition, one that combined the raw power of the exiles with the ancient rituals of the Sith species. And let's just say, moderation was not on the menu. This new order embraced strength, ambition, dominance, and control. Where the Jedi sought balance and detachment, the Sith focused on emotion, passion, anger, love, hatred, all as pathways to greater power. They believed the Force didn't punish you for using it selfishly. In fact, the Force rewarded those who bent it to their will. The Jedi may have created their worst enemy without realizing it, because in trying to contain the darkness, they just flung it across the galaxy, where it would fester, mutate, and grow into something far more dangerous. They built massive temples and tombs. They began experimenting even further with alchemy and Force manipulation. They created weapons and beasts the Jedi had never dreamed of. And they remembered. They remembered the Republic. They remembered the Jedi. They remembered exile. And slowly, they began planning revenge. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For now, this was the birth of the true Sith Order. They weren't called Darth anything yet. That came later. Modesty wasn't really the theme. They organized themselves into ruling castes, each based on power, heritage, and Force ability. You couldn't just run for office on Korriban. You had to dominate your rivals, prove your bloodline, and preferably decapitate someone important while doing it. Dark rituals quickly became the glue that held this strange new order together. But to them, this was the pinnacle of knowledge. They weren't trying to be evil. They genuinely believed they had evolved beyond the narrow teachings of the Jedi. They saw the Force not as something to serve, but something to master, and they didn't care how many bones they had to stack to get there. With this explosion of dark knowledge, the first Sith holocrons were created. These weren't your average Jedi training cubes. Sith holocrons were cryptic, dangerous, and sometimes sentient. Some could only be opened with blood sacrifice, others responded to hatred or fear. They were more than storage devices. They were weapons, teachers, and traps all at once. These holocrons helped preserve the rituals, spells, and philosophical arguments of the first Sith Lords. And more importantly, they allowed the Sith to pass down their teachings without relying on trust or personal bonds. No need for a Jedi-style master and apprentice when you could cram your evil wisdom into a cube that insults the next guy who tries to use it. Over time, Korriban began to shift. Korriban turned from a place of spiritual worship into a political capital, the dark mirror of Coruscant. Instead of being ruled by law or compromise, it was ruled by hierarchy, ambition, and constant pressure. Every Sith Lord wanted to rise above the others, and every apprentice wanted to someday overthrow their master. It was a system built on betrayal, and everyone was fine with that. Actually, it was kind of the point. That's how the early Sith power structure took shape. At the top were the oldest and strongest lords, often the original exiles or their direct descendants. Beneath them were lesser lords, ruling over smaller regions or specialized in certain dark arts. Then came the sorcerers, the alchemists, the assassins, and finally, the warriors and slaves. But don't be fooled, power could shift overnight. If someone proved stronger, smarter, or more ruthless, they could climb the ladder. And if a lord grew complacent, they didn't get voted out. They just disappeared. It was a brutal, violent, deeply unstable empire, but it worked for them. Because in Sith ideology, strength was stability. If you couldn't hold your throne, you didn't deserve it. And if someone killed you to take your place, then maybe they were the better Sith. And so the foundations were set. It was nothing like the Jedi Order. And that was the whole point. And I almost forgot about King Adus. Whether you think of him as a real historical monarch or a mythical supervillain invented to scare young Sithlings into behaving, one thing's for sure, Adus left a shadow long enough to stretch across millennia. He was said to have been born over 5,000 years before the rise of the Galactic Empire, back when the Sith species still had horns on their heads, bone armor on their chests, and an alarming number of rituals involving lava pits. This guy was literally a dinosaur in Star Wars universe. The ancient Sith were deeply tied to their planet's harsh environment and its spiritual landscape. It was violent, mystical, and brutally tribal. But Adus, he mastered it. Most records describe Adus as a literal giant, like 2 meters plus tall, deep obsidian skin, and glowing red eyes that never blinked. His voice supposedly shook walls, and his mere presence could silence entire rooms. That's the sort of thing historians usually file under embellishment, but even so, it paints the picture. He was crowned the Sithari, a word that roughly translates to overlord or perfect being. The Sith viewed him as chosen by the Force itself. What made Adus remarkable was his philosophy. He unified the warring Sith clans of Korriban under a single rule, turning scattered priest kings into loyal vassals. No more family feuds with blood sacrifices under a double eclipse. Now it was organized blood sacrifices with uniforms and a hierarchy. Progress. His system of governance was built on 2 things: absolute dominance and ritualized fear. Sith society wasn't a democracy. It wasn't even a dictatorship. It was a spiritual theocracy where the king was the living embodiment of the dark side. If you obeyed, you were given protection, resources, and status. If you defied him, you were turned into a warning. Simple as that. Some stories say Adus welcomed the exiles at first, intrigued by their knowledge of the Force. Others suggest he immediately sensed a threat and prepared for war. Either way, there was a falling out, and it didn't end with a polite handshake. According to Sith myth, Adus was eventually killed. Some say by betrayal, others say in battle against Offworlders, and with his death, the original Sith unity collapsed. His holocrons were stolen, his empire fractured, and the exiles stepped into the power vacuum like kids in a candy store. But even after death, Adus wasn't done shaping history. His legacy became the blueprint for what Sith rulership would look like forever. Rule through fear, survival of the strongest, and the idea that death was just another form of ascension. Later, Sith Lords from Marka Ragnos to Darth Bane all studied his teachings. It's also around this time that the Sith started looking beyond Korriban. The exiles built ships, raised armies, and began moving from planet to planet. Ziost, Malachor, eventually Droma Kars, all were touched by Sith influence. Let's move forward in our timeline. One of the original exiles I mentioned earlier, a former Jedi, widely considered to be the very first Dark Lord of the Sith, Ajunta Pall. He was a genius, arrogant, sharp and ruthless. Pall believed the Jedi were holding back the true potential of the Force. Why preserve peace when you could conquer death? Why maintain order when you could dominate chaos? His vision wasn't to gain power, it was to reshape the galaxy. He believed that peace was a lie, and only through conflict could strength be born. Sound familiar? Eventually the Jedi Council had enough. On Korriban, the Sith bowed and the exiles ruled. Just like that, time passed and Ajunta Pall became something no Jedi had ever been before. A king. But he wasn't content with royalty. He took a new title, one that would echo through millennia. He called himself the Dark Lord of the Sith. That single decision changed galactic history. Under his leadership, Sith philosophy transformed from scattered tribal mysticism into a codified religion of power. The rule of the strong was written in blood. Ajunta Pall taught his new Sith followers how to build lightsabers powered by synthetic crystals, the first true Sith blades. The Sith Empire loved him so much they practically deified him. They painted murals of him conquering beasts and planets. They carved statues of him, holding his blade with eyes like fire. But the real Ajunta Pall was already having doubts. Somewhere in the twilight of his life, something changed. He began to regret what he'd built. Maybe it was the infighting. Maybe it was the death cults. Or maybe it was the endless cycle of betrayal he'd unleashed. The Sith Empire was a trap, and he knew it. All that power had come at a price. We don't know exactly what happened to him at the end. There are legends that say he sealed himself inside his tomb voluntarily. Others claim he was betrayed and killed by his own apprentices. What we do know is that his tomb became one of the first in the Valley of the Dark Lords, its entrance guarded by ancient machines and puzzles, and deep within, his sword, a blade that could have belonged to a god, but now sat rusted beside the bones of a man. Thousands of years later, during the Jedi Civil War, Revan would enter that tomb, and there, the ghost of Ajunta Pall would speak again, not as a conqueror, but as a man filled with remorse. He didn't scream or threaten or lash out. He asked for peace. He even asked Revan to take his blade away, to destroy it, to erase the symbol of what he'd done. You wouldn't expect the first Sith Lord to end like that. But maybe that's the irony. Ajunta Pall created a legacy built on strength, but in the end, he realized something the Sith would always struggle with. Strength without wisdom leads only to ruin. He didn't die in battle. He didn't die laughing like Palpatine. He faded out quietly, alone in a tomb, hoping someone would learn from his mistake. And yet the Sith did not. They kept his teachings. They took his title. They ignored his regrets. Every Dark Lord after him claimed to be better, stronger, more ruthless. But none of them ever escaped the curse, the hunger for power that always devours itself. He was the original, the prototype, the one who planted the seed. Without him, there would be no Darth Bane, no Sidious, no Sith Empire, and he probably would have hated what his empire became. After the foundational era of Ajunta Pall and the first generations of Dark Lords who shaped Sith culture, many Sith rose and fell, each adding their mark. But among all these ancient names, one stands out for his legendary rule and lasting influence: Marka Ragnos. His reign was a defining epoch that shaped Sith identity and power for centuries to come. Marka Ragnos was a pure-blood Sith, born and raised on the harsh red world of Korriban. Unlike the exiled Jedi, who had brought their own dark teachings to Korriban centuries earlier, Marka grew up immersed fully in Sith culture, their brutal rites, their warrior code, and their reverence for strength above all else. What set Marka apart wasn't his bloodline, but his vision and leadership. Before his time, the Sith Empire was less an empire and more a patchwork of rival clans, each led by ambitious warlords who saw others as threats to be crushed rather than allies to unite. This constant infighting weakened the Sith, leaving them vulnerable to external threats and internal collapse. Marka Ragnos changed all that. He was a brilliant strategist and charismatic leader, capable of commanding respect and loyalty from the fiercest Sith warriors. His power wasn't only raw strength in the Force or skill in combat, though he had those in abundance. It was his ability to unite fractious clans under one banner. Through a combination of military might, cunning diplomacy, and calculated intimidation, Marka forged the scattered Sith into a formidable, centralized empire. Under his rule, the Sith Empire grew beyond Korriban, expanding its reach into neighboring star systems and deep into the unknown regions. Sith fleets sailed through hyperspace, conquering worlds and establishing outposts that secured Sith influence far from their home world. This expansion was deliberate empire building. Marka sought to establish a Sith dominion that could rival the Republic itself. One of Marka's lasting legacies was his philosophy of power. To him, the dark side was a way of life and a cosmic force to shape destiny. His teachings emphasized the importance of passion, anger, hatred, ambition as the true source of strength. Weakness, mercy, and hesitation were signs of decay. And to survive, the Sith must embrace their darker impulses fully and without shame. Marka Ragnos's doctrine also stressed unity through strength and dominance through fear. He believed that the Sith could only thrive when bound together by a common goal and led by a strong hand. Loyalty, even if enforced by fear, was essential. This idea of ruthless unity would echo in Sith philosophy for centuries and eventually influence the infamous Rule of Two, though Marka's empire was a very different beast, more a sprawling hierarchy of powerful Sith lords than a secretive pair. The Sith Empire, during Marka's reign, was a center of ancient knowledge and dark sorcery. Marka fostered the study of Sith alchemy, sorcery, and ancient magics that had been passed down through generations. Sith temples and academies were built across the Empire, places where apprentices learned to harness the Force's darkest energies, craft deadly weapons, and unlock secrets long buried beneath Korriban's crimson sands. Marka was also known for his personal strength and martial prowess. Legends say he was a fearsome duelist, wielding ancient Sith weapons and commanding the dark side with terrifying precision. Sith apprentices whispered stories of battles where Marka single-handedly held off entire armies, or where his mere presence bent the Force around him like a tempest. Despite his fearsome reputation, Marka was also a skilled statesman. He managed to maintain order in a society where betrayal was commonplace. Sith lords often schemed against each other, and assassinations were part of daily politics. Yet Marka's dominance was such that open rebellion was rare, and many Sith grudgingly acknowledged his supremacy. During his reign, Sith culture became more codified. The Sith Code, emphasizing the pursuit of power, passion, and victory, was adopted as the guiding creed. Rituals and ceremonies celebrating Sith history and their embrace of the dark side flourished. Marka understood that for the Sith to endure, they needed more than military strength. They needed a shared identity and purpose. It is worth noting that Marka Ragnos's rule was so long and stable that he became almost mythic during his lifetime. Tales circulated among Sith that he could commune with the spirits of the Sith dead, that his power transcended death. Whether true or not, these stories reinforced his aura and cemented his legacy as the pinnacle of Sith leadership. Marka Ragnos was the ultimate Sith Lord of his age, a titan in a galaxy still young enough to tremble beneath his shadow. The empire he held together would one day collapse, yes, but while he ruled, the Sith were a force that no one dared challenge. The circumstances surrounding Marka Ragnos's death are shrouded in mystery, legend, and a fair share of Sith gossip. Some stories say that Marka simply died of old age, slipping away peacefully while communing with the spirits of ancient Sith lords. Others whisper of darker causes: assassination by a jealous apprentice, betrayal within his own council, or even a catastrophic ritual gone wrong, unleashing forces he couldn't control. The death of Marka Ragnos was like the dropping of a stone into still Sith waters. The ripples quickly became waves. For centuries, Marka had been the unshakable pillar holding the Sith Empire together, a force of nature commanding loyalty through fear and respect. But with him gone, centuries of barely contained rivalries exploded, and the Sith found themselves at a crossroads. At the center of this brewing storm were two Sith Lords with very different ideas about the future. On one side was Ludo Kresh, a cautious and conservative leader who believed the Sith should stay hidden in the shadows, biding their time until the galaxy was ripe for conquest. He favored consolidation, patience, and secrecy, believing that open war with the Republic would only bring ruin. Kresh was a voice of restraint, warning his fellow Sith against reckless ambition. Opposing him was Naga Sadow, an ambitious and cunning Sith Lord who saw the situation through fire-tinted lenses. To Sadow, the Sith were no longer meant to lurk in forgotten corners of space. They were destined to rise and reclaim their place as masters of the galaxy. The time for shadows was over. The Sith had to strike boldly and decisively. This rivalry was more than political disagreement. It was a clash of philosophies and styles. Ludo Kresh preferred careful strategy and defense, while Naga Sadow believed in overwhelming offense, deception, and psychological warfare. Sadow was not just a warrior. He was a master of illusions, sorcery, and manipulation. His use of the dark side wasn't just brute force, but an art form. He could conjure vast phantom fleets, make entire warships disappear and reappear at will, and cloud enemy minds with terrifying visions. In battle, Sadow fought not just with laser blasts and lightsabers, but with smoke, mirrors, and nightmares. Despite his power, Sadow needed a spark, a reason to unite the Sith behind his warlike vision. Fate, or perhaps pure bad luck for the Republic, provided one. In the vast, unexplored depths of the unknown regions, two young Republic explorers, named Gav and Jory Daragon, set out on a mission to map uncharted space and find new worlds. They were idealistic, brave, and crucially, ignorant of just how dangerous the territory was. On their journey, they accidentally stumbled into Sith-controlled space, orbiting the ancient and forbidding world of Korriban. From the Sith perspective, this was either an intrusion or a divine sign. Naga Sadow immediately recognized an opportunity. Whether or not the Republic had sent these explorers intentionally was irrelevant. Sadow twisted the event into a justification for war. He declared that the Republic had sent spies to sabotage Sith power and infiltrate their secrets. Sadow didn't stop there. In a ruthless political move, he orchestrated a fake prison break, making it appear as though Republic agents were actively trying to free captured Sith prisoners. He even ordered the assassination of certain Sith Council members and laid the blame squarely on the Republic, stoking fury and paranoia within the Sith ranks. His deception worked like a charm. The Sith, hungry for a cause to rally behind, quickly unified around Sadow's call to arms. He was seen not only as a war leader, but as a visionary, ready to bring the Sith Empire out of the shadows and into galactic prominence. To intimidate his enemies and bolster his forces, Sadow unleashed his secret weapon, illusions. He conjured vast phantom fleets, making his armada appear colossal and invincible. Enemy spies and Republic scouts reported seeing fleets that didn't exist, ghost ships that vanished as quickly as they appeared, an overwhelming force where there was only trickery. The invasion plan was daring and audacious. Sadow aimed to strike quickly and decisively, using his illusory numbers to bluff the Republic into surrender or retreat. His early campaigns were shockingly successful. Republic worlds in the nearby sectors fell with frightening speed, unprepared for the ferocity and scale of the Sith assault. For a moment, it seemed the Sith Empire might reclaim its lost glory and shake the foundations of the Republic itself. But illusions, no matter how convincing, don't hold up under pressure forever. The Republic soon caught on. Commanders realized that many of the Sith warships were phantoms, illusions designed to confuse and terrorize rather than to fight. Republic forces adapted their strategies, focusing on actual threats and ignoring ghost fleets. Meanwhile, the Sith Empire's internal unity began to crack. Not all Sith Lords were on board with Sadow's reckless gamble. Some doubted his ambitions and the wisdom of provoking the Republic so openly. As cracks formed in Sith cohesion, rivalries reignited and loyalty faltered. The Republic, meanwhile, was not blind to these Sith sorceries. As the war dragged on, Republic commanders and Jedi began to understand that defeating Sadow required more than just ships and soldiers. They had to face the sorcerer's tricks, illusions, and dark rituals head-on. In response, the Republic launched a fierce counterattack. Jedi Knights led dangerous missions to uncover the source of Sadow's power and disrupt his sorcery. Battles raged not just in space but in the mystical realms of the Force, as Jedi and Sith clashed on multiple fronts. This counter-offensive fractured the Sith Empire. The grand vision of a united Sith front started to crumble under the pressure of Republic resistance and internal dissent. Many Sith followers began to doubt Sadow's leadership, especially as his mental state showed signs of decline. The very power he sought to control was beginning to control him. Eventually, Sadow was defeated. Forced to retreat, he fled to a remote, forgotten corner of the galaxy. Effectively exiled from the Sith Empire he had once sought to rebuild. In exile, Sadow lived out his days away from the galactic stage, a fallen titan whose ambition had overreached. But exile wasn't the end of Sadow's influence. The Great Hyperspace War, despite ending in his defeat, left an indelible impact on the galaxy. His dark experiments, illusions, and tactics became a blueprint for future Sith Lords who sought to harness the dark side's full potential. The idea that fear, deception, and psychological warfare were as important as raw power stayed with Sith philosophy for centuries. Sadow's legacy also taught the Republic and Jedi valuable lessons about the dangers of underestimating the Sith. The war showed that the Sith could come back from defeat, evolving their methods and growing more dangerous over time. In many ways, Naga Sadow was both a warning and an inspiration. He was proof that the dark side's power is seductive, but can consume those who chase it recklessly. And yet his willingness to push boundaries and explore forbidden knowledge set the stage for future Sith Lords like Darth Bane and Darth Sidious, who would refine Sith strategy into the deadly, patient threat the galaxy would later face. So, while Sadow himself ended in exile, his shadow loomed large. The illusions he crafted, the dark rituals he performed, and the war he unleashed shaped Sith history and galactic politics for generations to come. And if you ever hear tales of Sith spirits haunting the tombs of Korriban, you're hearing echoes of Sadow's dark experiments reaching beyond the grave. Eventually, the fractures in Sadow's plans didn't come from Republic resistance. They came from within the Sith Empire itself. One of his strongest rivals, Ludo Kresh, had been warning the other Sith from the very beginning. Kresh believed Sadow's ambitions would lead to ruin. He wasn't any less Sith. He believed in tradition, in control, and in maintaining the Sith ways without needlessly provoking the Republic. He thought Sadow's warmongering was reckless and dangerous. The two clashed more than once. When Sadow's war started falling apart, Kresh returned, attempting to seize power and take control of what remained of the Sith fleet. Their final confrontation ended in a direct battle between the two, which Sadow barely survived. Kresh was killed, but by then the damage was done. The Sith were hopelessly divided. With Kresh gone and Sadow weakened, there was no longer a strong, united Sith front. This internal conflict, the rivalry, the betrayal, the ambition, it was a classic Sith downfall. Kresh had been right, even if no one wanted to hear it at the time. Sadow's war with the Republic had cost the Sith dearly. The fleets were broken, the territories lost, and their enemies were closing in. And now, without Kresh around to balance things, there was no unity left. Just scattered warlords, broken armies, and a leader who was quickly running out of power. And now we have the Dark Ages of the Sith. The Sith were almost completely wiped out. The once glorious Sith Empire, which had stretched across multiple star systems, was now reduced to a bunch of ruined worlds and a handful of survivors running for their lives. From a distance, it probably looked like the Sith were gone for good. The Republic declared victory. The Jedi, for the most part, returned to their usual business. There was peace again, or at least the illusion of it. But underneath that peace Seeds were quietly being planted. The Sith weren't just hiding, they were learning. In exile, the Sith began to reflect. In their own twisted way, some of them started asking the uncomfortable questions that would eventually lead to something new. Why had the Sith lost? Was it because of the Jedi's strength, the Republic's numbers, or was it something deeper? Was the problem within the Sith themselves? These questions wouldn't be answered right away, but the idea was starting to spread. Maybe the constant betrayals and rivalries weren't a strength after all. Maybe being loud, visible and arrogant, like Sadow, wasn't the path forward. Maybe secrecy, patience and discipline were the real weapons of the dark side. It's important to understand that during this period, there was no one Sith leader, no Darth title, no grand vision. It was just remnants, angry, bitter, sometimes delusional Darksiders who clung to the idea of revenge. And yet, in this chaos, the Sith Order wasn't dying, it was evolving. Most Jedi at the time probably thought they had finally won. The Sith Empire was gone. The survivors were scattered. The threat seemed neutralized. But history has a habit of repeating itself. Especially in Star Wars, what they couldn't see was that this so-called victory created exactly the kind of conditions that would allow something far more dangerous to take root in the future. Right now, we're in the aftermath. The fall of the Sith Empire had created a vacuum, and although the galaxy thought the Sith were finished, all it really did was push them underground, where they would stew in their hatred, plot in silence, and wait for the right moment to return. Because if there's one thing the Sith never forget, it's a loss, and they don't forgive it either. You probably wouldn't recognize the name Freedon Nadd if you're not deeply familiar with the murky corners of Star Wars history. Nadd, a name that would echo through the galaxy like a ghost in the walls for centuries. His story, it's the start of something far more persistent. A revival of forbidden knowledge. A return of things the galaxy thought buried for good. It all started, as many of these stories do, with a Jedi who didn't quite fit. Freedon Nadd was once a student of the Jedi Order, born with impressive talent and a powerful connection to the Force. In the eyes of his peers, he was destined for greatness, perhaps even a seat on the High Council one day, but beneath the calm Jedi exterior, something was off. Nadd was restless, impatient. He found himself constantly at odds with the Order's teachings. He didn't want to learn how the Force worked. He wanted to know why the Jedi were so obsessed with limiting it, why they were afraid of anger or passion or ambition. He wasn't drawn to chaos for its own sake, but he was deeply frustrated by the narrow path the Jedi offered. To him, it felt like they were trying to hide something, like they were afraid of what he could become if he ever truly let go. Eventually, this tension came to a head. Nadd was passed over for the rank of Jedi Knight. The Order was holding him back. Whether it was fear or tradition, they had no interest in letting someone like him reach his potential. So, he walked away. Nadd went looking. He scoured ancient records, whispered rumors, forgotten myths, anything that hinted at powers the Jedi wouldn't dare touch. And that trail eventually led him to a dead planet, Korriban. This planet had become a tomb world, literally. Nadd felt it immediately. The Force was thick here and twisted, not like the dark side he'd heard about in Jedi lectures. This was older, colder, less rage and more memory. The kind of power that didn't scream. It whispered. In one of those tombs, deep below the surface, Freedon Nadd found something that shouldn't have existed, the spirit of Naga Sadow. He had fled to Yavin 4 after the fall of the Sith and eventually died in exile. But through the sheer power of his will, and probably a few arcane rituals, his spirit had remained, trapped, but still active. Sadow became his teacher, guiding Nadd through Sith rituals, ancient secrets, and forgotten techniques the Jedi had buried centuries ago. And Nadd, in turn, became something else entirely. No longer a student of peace, he was becoming Sith not only in power, but in philosophy. It's important to understand that Nadd believed in what he was learning. That power, real power, wasn't evil, it was simply honest, and that the Jedi, with all their rules and taboos, were lying to themselves. But Nadd didn't stay a student for long. After years of instruction, he turned on Sadow, destroying or banishing his lingering spirit, depending on which version of the story you read. Nadd had no interest in being anyone's apprentice forever, and in a very Sith kind of way, this was a graduation ceremony. The final lesson, kill your master, With Sadow gone, Nadd became a Dark Lord in his own right, a true Sith, and more importantly, the only Sith in the galaxy at that time. He left Korriban with more than just knowledge, because up to that point, the dark side had been in decline. The old Sith Empire was dust. The Jedi were still strong, still unified. There were no Inquisitors or secret apprentices hiding in the shadows. And then Nadd arrived. He travelled to the planet Onderon, a wild and unstable world that had once been colonized by the Republic, but had slipped into chaos. The people there were locked in a bitter conflict. City dwellers versus beast-riding exiles, nobles versus warlords. In other words, perfect ground for a Sith. Nadd stepped in and changed everything. He used his knowledge of the dark side to gain influence through manipulation. He didn't declare himself a Sith Lord to the people. He acted more like a prophet or a god king, twisting the culture around him. His teachings became dogma. His rituals became law. People worshipped him. And when he eventually died, he didn't really leave, because Freedon Nadd had learned from the best. Just like Sadow before him, Nadd made sure death wouldn't be the end. His tomb was constructed with care, deep within the jungles of Onderon's moon. His spirit endured, anchored to the world he had shaped. And from that tomb, Nadd would continue to whisper, to corrupt, to call out to those willing to listen. But that part of the story is just getting started. After his death, the royal families of Onderon became entangled in his lingering influence. Generations of rulers heard his voice in the shadows. Some tried to suppress the old teachings, but others embraced them. Cults sprung up in the capital city of Iziz, some public, others secretive and militant. The most extreme cultists believed that Nadd would one day return in full form, leading Onderon to become the center of a new Sith empire. At this point, the Jedi had no choice but to get involved. But by the time they arrived, it was already too late for a clean solution. The dark side had infected every level of Onderonian society, especially among the royal bloodlines. Conflicts broke out between factions loyal to the light and those devoted to the legacy of Nadd. And for the Jedi, it became a war against an idea, against whispers in the dark. They tried to destroy Nadd's tomb, tried to sever his connection to the living world, but nothing truly worked. Every time they buried his memory, it rose again in another form, sometimes in a relic, sometimes in a prophecy, and sometimes in a person. The most infamous example of this was Exar, a powerful Jedi who would eventually fall to the dark side, seduced by the allure of ancient Sith teachings. And while Kun never met Nadd in life, it was Nadd's ghost who personally guided his descent into darkness. It happened long after the Onderon crisis had mostly faded from public concern. Kun, a brilliant but arrogant Jedi Knight, became obsessed with learning forbidden knowledge. The Jedi Council warned him to stop, but like Nadd before him, Kun believed that the Order was holding him back. So, like many wayward seekers before him, he ended up on Dexun, and then Korriban, and finally in the presence of Freedon Nadd's lingering spirit. Nadd promised him power, showed him the history the Jedi had buried, and when Kun refused to fully give in, Nadd shattered his bones and left him dying, until Kun crawled back, begged for his life, and swore himself to the dark side. That was the real legacy of the Spirit Lords, the cycle of seduction they left behind. Nadd's ghost trained Exar Kun, who would go on to become a Dark Lord himself, commanding a new generation of fallen Jedi. And the pattern repeated over and over. Tombs, spirits, artifacts, hidden cults, whispers in the minds of those who thought they were strong enough to resist. Even when their empires fell, their teachings didn't die. They just changed shape. They survived in books, in temples, in cursed holocrons, sealed behind heavy blast doors in forgotten vaults. Sith lords like Nadd understood that immortality didn't have to mean flesh and blood. As long as someone somewhere remembered their name or found their tomb, they could still shape the galaxy. On Dexun and Onderon, even centuries later, archaeologists and treasure hunters still report strange visions. Madness, sudden violence. The old cults are mostly gone now, but echoes of their rituals show up in weird places, and the idea that the dark side can be inherited, passed on like a virus, lives on in the minds of every Jedi who studies Sith history. In that sense, Freedon Nadd won. He never ruled the galaxy, not in the way the ancient Sith Lords once dreamed, but his ghost lasted longer than most of them, and his corruption quiet, invisible, and hard to track, poisoned generations of Force users who came after. And he wasn't the only one. By the time Exar Kun began to rise in power, the Jedi Order had begun to understand something terrifying. You can win the war, you can defeat the army, you can burn the temples and scatter the followers, but you cannot kill an idea. Not completely. Not when the dark side is willing to wait, and whisper, and teach, even from beyond the grave. And let's cover more of Exar Kun's life. This guy was one of the strongest Jedi and Sith ever lived. He even constructed a new lightsaber, a double-bladed one, the first of its kind in this era. We already covered most of the part with Nadd, but still there is more. With Nadd's lingering guidance, Kun began experimenting with Sith sorcery, real sorcery, the kind that mutated living beings, bent the Force to his will, and turned knowledge into weapons. He used rituals that hadn't been seen in millennia, raised armies from nothing, and worst of all, he enslaved the Massassi, a warrior race twisted by dark alchemy, warping them further to suit his needs. Freedon Nadd believed he had found a worthy vessel, but Kun had learned well from the Sith. He didn't want to serve anyone. He turned on Nadd's spirit and annihilated it, banishing the old Sith Lord from existence. That's when he truly became something else, not a fallen Jedi, but a Dark Lord in his own right. Kun saw the Jedi Order as weak and hypocritical. He blamed them for holding him back, for treating the Force like a prison when he believed it should be limitless. So he set his sights on tearing the Jedi down from the inside. He began recruiting. He reached out to disillusioned Jedi across the galaxy, young knights and Padawans who, like him, felt stifled by the Order. He offered them forbidden knowledge, secret teachings, and a new philosophy. Many of them listened, some followed, and with every convert, Exar Kun's power grew. Yavin 4 became his new empire. Yes, the same place where the rebels would one day blow up the Death Star. Exar Kun didn't just explore the ruins, he claimed them. His temple grounds buzzing with dark rituals, alchemy experiments, and preparations for war. But he wouldn't fight it alone. Because out there, in another part of the galaxy, was a warrior named Ulic Droma, and their stories were about to collide. But that's for the next part. Ulic Droma never meant to fall. He was one of the Jedi Order's brightest warriors, born on the planet Alderaan and trained on Ossus. Brave, gifted, and idealistic, Ulic had every reason to rise through the ranks as a model Jedi Knight. But history doesn't often reward purity, and the story of Ulic Droma became one of the Order's deepest regrets, because he didn't fall alone. It began with a mission. Ulic and his brother Kay, along with Jedi Master Arka, were dispatched to the planet Onderon. Though the original threat had been suppressed, darkness clung to the world like damp air. Ulic saw firsthand how generations of spirit worship and Sith rituals had left invisible cracks in the very culture of Onderon. But it wasn't until the arrival of a new cult, the Krath, that Ulic's real descent began. The Krath weren't a Sith order, not at first. They were aristocrats from the Empress Teta system who'd discovered Sith texts, and instead of fearing them, they treated them like toys. The siblings Satel and Alima Keto used dark side alchemy, illusions, and forbidden artifacts, like party tricks. But as their power grew, so did their ambitions. And soon, they had seized control of the entire Empress Teta system. The Jedi tried to intervene. It went poorly. Ulic was wounded during the mission. His master Arka was killed. And that grief, that sense of powerlessness, haunted Ulic like a weight he couldn't shake. Convinced that the Jedi weren't doing enough to stop the Krath, Ulic made a dangerous decision. He would go undercover. He would infiltrate the Krath from within, learn their ways, and destroy them from the inside. The Council warned him. This was how many had fallen before. But Ulic was confident. He thought he was strong enough. The Krath welcomed him. Slowly, subtly, they broke him down. Alima Keto, in particular, drew Ulic deeper into their inner circle. Eventually, the line between acting and becoming blurred. Ulic began using Sith magic, then drawing on rage, then issuing commands not as a spy, but as a general. In time, he wasn't pretending anymore. And then came Exar Kun. Across the galaxy, the fallen Jedi Exar Kun was making his own rise. When Kun and Ulic finally crossed paths, it was a union. The spirit of Marka Ragnos, another long-dead Sith Lord, appeared before them and proclaimed Exar Kun, the new Dark Lord of the Sith, and Ulic his shadow hand. From that moment on, the Sith were reborn, and the galaxy would never be the same. What followed is known as the Great Sith War. Ulic led fleets of Mandalorian warriors, lured into the conflict by promises of glory. He struck at the Republic's heart, staging invasions of Coruscant and other core worlds. Exar hunted Jedi across the galaxy, twisting them to his cause with promises of power. It wasn't a galactic war, it was a civil war within the Jedi Order. For a time, it looked like the Sith might win. The Republic was fracturing. Trust in the Jedi was fading. Whole systems fell to the dark side, not out of fear, but fascination. Dark side cults spread again. The galaxy was repeating its own nightmares. But darkness always burns out eventually. Ulic, for all his power, had not lost every trace of humanity. After a series of brutal campaigns, including the devastating use of Sith superweapons, Ulic's own brother Kay tried to reach him, begging him to stop. In a moment of fury, Ulic struck Kay down, and then everything broke. In that moment, the illusion shattered. Ulic realized what he had become. The Jedi seized their chance. They launched a final, desperate attempt to sever his connection to the Force. They succeeded. Ulic was left powerless. The war wasn't over yet, but the Sith were unraveling. Without Ulic's strength, the Republic pushed back. Exar final act was one of desperation. He returned to Yavin 4 and enacted a dark ritual, sacrificing all his Massassi followers to preserve his spirit within the temple walls. His body died, but his essence lingered, another shadow waiting in the darkness for the right moment to return. The Great Sith War had ended, but the wounds it left behind would last for centuries. Ulic Droma wandered the galaxy in exile. He tried to live quietly, away from conflict. You know, when you first hear the name Darth Vitiate, you might picture a classic Sith Lord storming across the galaxy, commanding legions of followers right from the start. But that's not how his story begins. Before he was Emperor, Vitiate was a shadow on a quiet, distant world called Nathema. It's remote, shrouded in mystery, and far from the bustling centres of the Republic or Jedi activity. The planet's atmosphere was thick with ancient Sith traditions, but the society there was pretty stagnant, stuck in old ways without much ambition beyond survival. Now, about his origins. They're pretty vague, partly because Vitiate himself made sure the details were erased or distorted later on. But what's agreed upon by historians and Sith scholars is that even as a child, he showed signs that were far beyond normal Force sensitivity. His connection to the Force, it was unique, almost like he could reach into it and pull out power that others didn't even know existed. While other Force users might struggle to lift objects or sense emotions, Vitiate was different. His Force presence was something that unsettled those around him without him even trying. Even as a youth on Nathema, Vitiate's ambition burned quietly, like a slow-moving flame. He wasn't interested in fame or rushing into the spotlight. Instead, he watched, learned, and planned. The Sith at the time were a fractured bunch, a bunch of lords fighting amongst themselves for scraps of power. Instead of jumping into the fight, he waited for the right moment. This was a calculated patience, the kind that only someone who believes they are destined for something bigger can have. And while others argued and battled openly, Vitiate took a different approach. He moved quietly through the Sith ranks, slipping past suspicion. His power was something to be reckoned with, but he used it subtly. He relied on manipulation and cunning. It's like he understood that real power is often about control behind the scenes, pulling strings, sowing distrust among rivals, and taking out obstacles before they even realized they were targets. By the time his reputation started spreading, Vitiate became the shadow behind every sudden betrayal, every unexpected death in the Sith Order. His rise was the quiet storm before the real war. At the same time, Vitiate was carefully gathering followers, but he didn't want a large army or a noisy cult. Instead, he chose a few key individuals, powerful, loyal Sith who shared his vision or whose skills complemented his own. These followers were his eyes and ears, his advisors and enforcers. They helped him solidify control over different Sith factions, spreading his influence like tendrils through the dark corners of the galaxy. What made Vitiate's followers stick with him wasn't only fear, though that played a role. It was something more subtle. Respect for his strength, yes, but also for his clarity of purpose. While other Sith Lords were often blinded by their own egos or petty rivalries, Vitiate had a clear vision. He wasn't interested in momentary victories or personal glory. He aimed to remake the Sith Order itself, to create a power so strong that no one could challenge it. And then came the moment when Vitiate's status shifted from a powerful Sith Lord to the Dark Lord of the Sith. It was the result of the old Sith Order fracturing under his influence. Many lords either swore loyalty to him or vanished one way or another. The Sith Council that once ruled was dissolved, replaced by a new order shaped by Vitiate's will. The transition was less a coup and more an inevitability. Vitiate's mastery over the Force, combined with his ruthless strategies, made resistance pointless. His presence alone commanded respect and fear. From that point on, he was the game itself. He used ancient Sith knowledge and forbidden dark rituals to push beyond the limits of life and death. Some say he even achieved immortality through these dark arts, feeding on the life force of others to extend his own existence. It was the vision of someone who wanted to become something eternal. By the time he had firmly claimed his position, Vitiate was already laying the groundwork for what would become his Sith Empire. It was an empire built on fear, dark sorcery, and the manipulation of the Force itself. His influence stretched far beyond Nathema, into distant systems and secret Sith enclaves. His early years were marked by quiet ambition, ruthless strategy, and a vision that extended beyond anything the Sith had seen before. And that's just the beginning of his story. He wanted to become something more, something eternal. And with that goal, his reign began in earnest. The formal consolidation of power was a matter of course. There was no need for widespread wars or uprisings against him. His reputation and strength were enough to keep everyone in line. Instead of ruling through fear alone, Vitiate governed with a cold, calculating precision that was much more effective. He understood that a steady hand and careful control over every aspect of the empire would serve him better than reckless displays of force. His style of leadership was clinical, willing to wait decades or even centuries to see his plans come to fruition. His hunger for power was immense, but it was quiet and controlled, an unending force that demanded more and more from the galaxy itself. He viewed himself as a cosmic entity, beyond ordinary mortal concerns like loyalty or honor. The Force was a tool, an endless source of energy, to be consumed, shaped, and wielded. Under his command, the Sith Empire expanded far beyond what had previously been imagined. He was twisting political systems, breaking alliances, and undermining opposition through secret manipulation. Planets would fall under his influence, not only by military might, but also through subversion and the seduction of power. His reach grew from the shadows into countless systems, each one bending to his will. Nathema, his homeworld, became the center of his greatest dark act. In a ritual of unimaginable scale, Vitiate drained the entire life force of the planet. This was no ordinary battle or conquest. It was a systematic extraction of all living energy, leaving the planet utterly lifeless. The planet transformed from a place of life into a void, a monument to Vitiate's insatiable hunger. This act was not mindless destruction. It was a calculated sacrifice to increase his own power to unprecedented levels. By consuming the life energy of an entire planet, he transcended normal limits, gaining a form of immortality and strength that would allow him to outlast centuries. The drained power became a wellspring from which he drew continually, fueling his dark sorcery and expanding his influence. The consequences of this ritual were felt across the galaxy. The silence of Nathema in the Force was a warning and a symbol. Power could be taken and wielded in ways no one had dared before. It was a demonstration that he was no ordinary Sith. He was an immortal force who could consume entire worlds to sustain himself. His plans involved dominating the entire galaxy. He sought to consume entire populations, turning living beings into sources of power. This hunger for energy was endless, and his efforts to feed it took him to the darkest corners of the galaxy. Throughout his reign, Vitiate molded the Sith Order into something both more unified and more terrifying. His rule brought stability to the Sith, but it was a stability built on fear, control, and a shared commitment to his vision. He pushed Sith philosophy toward a singular goal: total domination, fueled by an unending consumption of life and force energy. Under his command, Sith teachings and rituals grew darker and more extreme. The Sith learned to embrace the unnatural, the forbidden, and the eternal. His legacy changed the very nature of what it meant to be a Sith Lord, setting a precedent that would influence generations after him. The empire he built was more than just a political or military power. It was a living extension of his will, a dark force that spread its influence through space and time. The systems under his control were not just conquered territories, but parts of a vast machine designed to feed his endless hunger. While other Sith Lords had risen and fallen throughout history, none had achieved the cold, calculated longevity that Vitiate managed. His rule shaped the galaxy for centuries. Empires rose and fell, wars were fought. His methods of power, his dark rituals, and his vision of eternal domination influenced not only the Sith, but the entire galaxy's history. Even long after his death, stories of his hunger and immortality continued to inspire fear and caution. The Mandalorian Wars began, as many wars in the galaxy did, on the distant edges, far from Coruscant, far from the Jedi Temple. The Republic was still recovering from earlier conflicts, while the Mandalorian Neo-Crusaders saw a weakened galaxy as ripe for conquest. Their brutal campaign swept across the Outer Rim, subjugating system after system. Entire worlds fell before the Republic could even organize a proper response, yet despite the growing panic, the Jedi Council remained silent. To many across the Republic, this silence looked like cowardice. But within the Jedi Order, the reasoning was more complex. The Council feared that if Jedi entered the war, it would escalate the conflict even further, perhaps even awaken ancient darkness. They had sensed something distant and ominous in the Force, and believed it wasn't their place to wage war. So, they chose inaction. They waited, and the Mandalorians kept advancing. That's when Revan emerged, a gifted Jedi Knight known for his charisma, intelligence, and deep understanding of galactic history. To be honest, this guy was a walking aura farming, who can beat even Darth Vader in this. I mean, just look at him. Revan didn't share the Council's caution. Alongside his close friend Malak, he openly criticized the Order's inaction. They believed that the Jedi had a responsibility to protect the innocent, not only in word, but in action. For many young Jedi, Revan's words were compelling, and when he defied the Council and entered the war, he didn't go alone. A growing number of Jedi followed him, later known as the Revanchists. They believed in a Jedi's moral duty to act in the face of injustice. Revan quickly rose through the ranks, both in strategy and symbolism. To the Republic, he became a war hero, a tactical genius, someone who could win battles no one else could. He didn't just fight the Mandalorians. He outmaneuvered them, studied them, beat them at their own game. Under his leadership, Republic forces began to turn the tide, but the war changed him. With every campaign, every loss, Revan began to see the Republic's fragility more clearly. Corruption, bureaucracy, hesitation. He saw weakness at the heart of the system, a weakness that couldn't be allowed to continue if peace was ever going to last. Slowly, his focus shifted. He wasn't just trying to win the war anymore. He was beginning to envision what would come after. Victory wasn't enough. There needed to be order, strength, control. It all came to a head at Malachor 5. Revan's final strategy was as brutal as it was effective. He commissioned a superweapon known as the Mass Shadow Generator, placed under the command of a loyal general. At the climactic battle of the war, as the Mandalorians were drawn into one final confrontation, the weapon was activated. The results were catastrophic. The Mandalorian fleet was obliterated, but so were countless Republic soldiers. Malachor 5 itself was devastated, torn apart by gravitational forces. The war was over, but the cost was immense. Revan returned from the war a different man. He and Malak vanished into the unknown regions, chasing rumors of an ancient Sith presence. According to later accounts, they discovered something far more real than legend, a hidden Sith empire. What happened there remains unclear, but whatever they found, it changed everything. Some believe they were corrupted by a Dark Lord who bent their minds to his will. Others argue they simply found what they had already become. Regardless, Revan and Malak returned not as Jedi, nor as war heroes, but as Sith Lords. Revan took on the mantle of Dark Lord of the Sith, with Malak as his apprentice. But his was no mindless crusade of vengeance or domination. Revan's new Sith Empire was coldly strategic. He sought to unite the galaxy under one rule, not out of hatred, but from the belief that the Republic would always collapse without strong guidance. In his eyes, he was saving it, by force if necessary. Central to his plan was the discovery of the Starforge, an ancient space station of Rakatan origin, capable of producing endless fleets and war machines by feeding directly on the dark side of the Force. It was a symbol of unstoppable strength, and Revan intended to use it to conquer the Republic swiftly. His forces struck with terrifying precision. Planet after planet fell, Republic shipyards were destroyed, and for a time it seemed no one could stop him. But there was something different about Revan's war compared to the Mandalorian one. He spared some worlds, he assimilated others, he sought control, not destruction. Even within his new Sith Empire, there was structure and discipline. But as with all Sith, unity never lasted. Revan was supposed to be invincible, brilliant, charismatic, and terrifyingly strategic. Even after falling to the dark side, even after embracing the Sith teachings and ruling from a throne of blood and metal, many still followed him, not out of fear, but loyalty. But for all his power, for all the weapons and fleets and ancient Sith knowledge he had gathered, Revan never expected betrayal, and it came from the one person he trusted most. Darth Malak had once been his student, his shadow, and his brother in arms. But as the Starforge grew closer to completion, and Revan focused on war and domination, Malak's own ambition festered. Revan had made a critical mistake. He thought he could control the darkness. Malak had no such illusion. When the Jedi launched a desperate assault on Revan's flagship, Malak saw an opportunity. He turned his guns not only on the Jedi strike team, but on his own master. He fired upon Revan's ship mid-battle, leaving him for dead, or so he believed. The Jedi didn't let Revan die. Instead, they took his shattered body and fragmented mind and made a decision that would ripple through galactic history. They erased his memories. They gave him a new identity, a clean slate. In a way, they tried to fix him. It's hard to say if it was mercy or manipulation. Under the guidance of Bastila Shan and a few trusted companions, Revan was unknowingly led back through the chaos his past self had created. He relived the war he had once engineered, only this time from the other side. Piece by piece, his memories began to return. The flash of red lightsabers, the sound of screaming planets, the secrets of the Sith, and the power of the Starforge, all of it came back. And when it did, Revan had a choice. He could resume the mantle of Darth Revan, finish what he started, and rule the galaxy. Or he could defy the dark side, defeat Malak, and try to make amends, even if the damage could never be undone. Most stories tell the tale of redemption, that Revan turned away from the dark, defeated Malak, and destroyed the Starforge, that he became a hero again, ending the Jedi Civil War and giving the Republic a chance to rebuild. But even that happy version is soaked in blood, because during Malak's reign, the Sith had unleashed one of the worst Jedi purges in galactic history. Malak wasn't interested in subtle control. He was brutal. Entire systems were razed, libraries turned to ash, academies burned to the ground, Jedi were hunted across the galaxy, betrayed by their own soldiers, ambushed in their sanctuaries, cut down in droves. It was a war of extinction, one that left the Jedi Order reeling for decades. Even the Starforge itself was more than a symbol of power. It corrupted everything it touched. It didn't just manufacture tools of war, it fed on the dark side, on fear, rage, and hatred. It twisted those who used it, accelerating their descent into madness. Malak had been a violent man before. The Starforge made him a monster. When Revan finally confronted Malak aboard the Starforge, it was a confrontation between two fallen Jedi, both consumed by the same fire, both changed by war. But Revan had found something Malak had lost: clarity. The Starforge was destroyed, and with it the Sith war machine collapsed. The Republic limped away from the brink. The Jedi Order, battered and broken, began the long process of rebuilding, with fewer masters, fewer students, and deeper scars than ever before. But Revan didn't stay to help rebuild. He couldn't, because even with his memories returned, with Malak dead and the war over, something still haunted him. A vision, a half-remembered warning. He had seen something in the unknown regions, something darker than any Sith empire, something ancient and waiting, and if left unchecked, it would destroy everything. So he vanished, leaving behind no throne, no grave, and no explanation. That's the thing about Revan. Every attempt to define him falls short. Hero, villain, Jedi, Sith, none of it quite fits. He led armies, caused genocides, saved planets, betrayed friends, and earned the loyalty of strangers who barely understood why they followed him. He left a legacy that echoed across generations. Later, Sith like Darth Bane studied his teachings. Others, like Traya, whispered about the hypocrisy of the Jedi who rewrote a man's soul. To some, Revan proved that power could never be used without cost. To others, he was proof that even the most brilliant minds could be shattered by war. But the galaxy didn't forget him, and neither did the Force. The Jedi Civil War had ended, but the galaxy hadn't healed. Revan and Malak were gone, the Starforge destroyed, and the Republic still stood, technically. But the truth was far more grim. What followed wasn't peace, it was silence. An eerie, uncertain silence that covered the galaxy like a cold fog. And for the Jedi Order, it was a funeral march. The war had left the Jedi broken, scattered, and deeply wounded in ways they hadn't even begun to understand. Of the thousands of Jedi that once defended the Republic, only a few hundred remained. Most were dead, some had vanished into exile, and many had simply given up. After the chaos of Revan and Malak's reign, the Jedi didn't just lose numbers, they lost faith in themselves. The Council's refusal to act against the Mandalorians had led to Revan's fall. The secrets they kept had allowed the Starforge to be built, and their attempts to control the aftermath had only pushed more Jedi into doubt, so they stopped teaching. They stopped calling for new Padawans. They closed the temples, locked away their archives, and fell into a sort of fearful meditation, hoping that the storm had passed. It hadn't, because while the Jedi tried to disappear, something darker had been watching, and it had learned that it didn't need to launch a fleet or build a superweapon. It just needed to erase the Jedi quietly, one by one. This was the beginning of the Sith Triumvirate, a secretive alliance of three very different dark side warlords, each broken in their own way, each feeding off the ruins left by Revan's war. At the center of it was a former Jedi Master named Traya, or rather, what was left of her. Rejected by the Jedi Council for questioning the Force itself, she had gone in search of answers, and found them in the corrupted teachings left behind by Revan. She became Darth Traya, the so-called Lord of Betrayal, but her vision of the Sith was strange, not one of domination, but of revelation. She believed the Force itself was flawed, a cruel will that manipulated both Sith and Jedi alike, and she wanted to break it, but her apprentices, Darth Nihilus and Darth Sion, did not share her philosophy. They were monsters in a more literal sense. Nihilus, a being consumed by an insatiable hunger for life, had become something less than a man and more like a force of nature. He could consume entire planets through the Force, leaving behind only silence. Sion, on the other hand, was pain incarnate, a body shattered by death and reassembled through sheer hatred. He couldn't die because he refused to, holding himself together through willpower alone. These two did not want to challenge the Force. They wanted to use it, to drain it, and when Traya's teachings began to threaten their power, they betrayed her, violently. They cast her out, cut her off from the Force, and left her broken in the shadows of the Sith Academy on Malachor 5, the very planet where Revan had won the Mandalorian Wars. It was a poetic execution, and it didn't work. Now severed from the Force but still alive, Traya began working from the shadows once more. She would find her own apprentice, not to rule the galaxy, but to reshape it. And while she plotted her revenge, Nihilus and Sion unleashed a new kind of war. They began what came to be known as the First Jedi Purge. But it didn't happen through open combat. Instead, they hunted Jedi individually, quietly. They used fear, whispers, corrupted allies. A temple would be found empty. A master would be ambushed mid-mission. A Padawan would vanish during training. It was a slow bleed, almost surgical. They were trying to erase, to remove every trace of the Jedi, so that no one would remember what they once stood for. And the Jedi Council, already weak and scattered, was powerless to stop it. They couldn't agree on how to respond. Many believed the Order had failed too greatly to be saved. Others thought the Force was testing them. Some simply disappeared without a trace. By the time the galaxy realized what was happening, it was too late. Entire worlds had gone silent. Refugees whispered about wounds in the Force, Jedi sanctuaries were burned, and those who survived were in hiding, constantly moving, constantly afraid. The Sith Triumvirate wanted to make sure the Jedi weren't just dead. They wanted them forgotten, and in that darkness there was no prophecy, just the faint hope that someone, somewhere, would remember what the Jedi were meant to be and have the strength to rebuild. But that hope was faint, and it flickered more each day. In the end, Nihilus was brought down by those he underestimated, Visas Ma, the last of the Miraluka, and the Jedi exile, Meetra Surik. Visas had once served him, even worshipped him, but in time she saw the truth. He was nothing, an empty shell powered by addiction. In the long shadow of Revan's war and the collapse of the Jedi Order, there remained a handful of figures whose fates were inseparable from the last true hope the Jedi had. One of the most overlooked yet deeply important figures was Meetra Surik, better known as the Jedi Exile. She survived the Jedi Purge, was shaped by war, and quietly carried the burden of what the Jedi Order might have become. Meetra Surik was once a Jedi Knight who served with distinction, right until the Order abandoned her. During the Mandalorian Wars, she followed Revan into battle. Meetra gave the final order to activate the mass shadow generator. She cut herself off from the Force that day, whether as an act of trauma or sheer will, and returned to the Jedi Council, expecting judgment. They gave her exile. Years later, as the galaxy was being slowly choked by Sith Lords who hunted Jedi in the shadows, she became the center of a quiet resistance, leading a group of Force-sensitive companions, many of them broken like herself, to confront the Sith Triumvirate. Visas Ma was a Miraluka, a species that sees entirely through the Force. She was born on the planet Qatar, a quiet world populated by her kind, and a group of Jedi who had come there for a secret conclave. But when Darth Nihilus, the embodiment of hunger in the Force, sensed their presence, he consumed the entire planet in a single moment. Visas survived. Nihilus spared her, perhaps as a twisted act of mercy, perhaps as a tool. She became his servant, his assassin, and for a time she believed in his vision of cleansing the galaxy through destruction. But Visas was never truly blind. She began to question the pain and emptiness she served. And when she encountered Meetra Surik, everything changed. They confronted him aboard his flagship, the Ravager, a crumbling vessel held together by the dark side. Nihilus tried to consume the exile, as he had countless others, but it didn't work. The exile was a wound in the Force too, her presence a void like his own. Their duel was a clash of echoes, two broken beings trying to erase one another. In the end, Nihilus died, as if the void itself had collapsed inward. Sion's fall was different. He couldn't be killed in battle, not truly, and Meetra didn't defeat him with a lightsaber. Instead, she broke him with words. She spoke to the man buried beneath the pain. She showed him that his immortality wasn't power, it was a curse, that holding on to life through agony wasn't living at all. In the quiet ruins of Malachor 5, Sion listened, and for the first time, he let go. He allowed himself to die. And finally, Traya. Traya had once trained the exile. She had guided her, manipulated her, challenged her beliefs. She claimed to be friend and foe at once, mentor and enemy. And in the end, her final test came at the heart of Malachor 5. There, in the Trayos Academy, she waited. Her confrontation with Meetra was a philosophical reckoning. Traya accused the Force of cruelty. She wanted to destroy it, to unchain the galaxy from its influence. She believed the Jedi and Sith were both slaves, locked in a cycle of extremes, puppets to a power they couldn't truly understand. Their duel was inevitable, and when Traya finally fell, she accepted death. The Sith Triumvirate was gone, but what they left behind was more dangerous than armies or fleets. They left questions about the Force, about control, about whether any ideology, light or dark, could ever truly bring balance. Traya's legacy lived on in whispers and doubts. Nihilus became a cautionary tale, a being so consumed by hunger that he lost all identity. Sion became a symbol of obsession, of what happens when pain becomes purpose. And Traya, she became a ghost in the philosophy of future Force users. Her teachings would inspire thinkers, dissidents, and heretics for centuries. Some saw her as a villain, others as a prophet. Meetra Surik, however, had one more journey left. She sensed Revan was in danger, still alive, imprisoned deep within Sith space by the true Sith Empire he had once discovered. Unable to ignore that call, she left the Republic behind and travelled alone to find him. What happened next is chronicled only in fragments. Mitra found Revan. She helped free him. But before they could escape, she was struck down by Scourge, a Sith Lord who had once allied with her. He betrayed her to gain favour with the Emperor, foreseeing that Revan's mission would fail. Mitra died in silence, her sacrifice unknown to most. Yet through the Force, her spirit lingered, guiding Revan in his final attempts to stop the darkness. In the end, neither Visas nor Mitra became legendary Jedi Masters etched into galactic monuments. But they were something else, people who carried the weight of the galaxy's darkest years without falling into it. And perhaps, in the long view of history, that matters even more. If you want to understand how the Sith survived for 1,000 years in secrecy, how they became smarter, deadlier, and more patient than ever before, you have to go back to him. To the story of one man raised in pain and isolation who looked at the Sith around him and said, "This isn't working." His name was Dessel, and his life began in a mining colony on Apatros. He was the son of an abusive father, stuck in a brutal cycle of labour and punishment deep underground, where sunlight and hope were equally rare. But even as a boy, Dessel felt something stir in him. Rage, power, intuition, something that warned him a second before a brawl broke out, or gave him the strength to crush someone who tried to push him too far. That power got him into trouble more than once. Eventually, after killing a Republic soldier in self-defense, during a game of Sabak, Dessel was forced to flee Apatros and join the Sith military under a false name. That's where everything changed. In the chaos of the new Sith Wars, he quickly rose through the ranks. He was unstoppable, dangerous, gifted, and the Sith noticed. He was taken to Korriban, to the Sith Academy, and given a new name, Bane. But once he joined the Sith, he realized something strange. Despite all their power, all their talk of strength and dominance, they were losing. The Brotherhood of Darkness, led by Lord Khan, had become bloated, disorganized, and self-congratulatory. Khan preached unity, equality among Sith, and collective victory. Ideas that sounded nice, but in Bane's eyes, violated the very essence of the dark side. The Sith were supposed to thrive on competition, on ambition, on the strongest rising above the weak. But here, every Sith Lord was equal, every rival was called brother. There were no consequences for failure, no true power to be earned. Bane saw it as a parody of the Sith philosophy, a mockery of everything the dark side stood for. He began to pull away, studying alone in ancient libraries, digging through forgotten holocrons from the old Sith empires, including the teachings of Darth Revan. Revan's words spoke to him like no Sith ever had. Power must be concentrated, not spread thin. The dark side required clarity of purpose, not endless squabbling. For the Sith to survive, the Order needed to be reborn, and Bane became obsessed with making it happen. But first, he needed to end what already existed. He abandoned the Brotherhood during a critical campaign and sought out knowledge on his own. Eventually, he travelled to the ancient world of Lahon, home of the Rakata and the long-lost Starforge ruins. There, he communed with the dark side itself, bathed in its presence, and emerged with absolute certainty. The Brotherhood had to be destroyed. Bane returned as their executioner. He manipulated Khan and the Sith Lords into gathering at Ruusan for one final battle against the Jedi. There, Khan deployed a catastrophic weapon known as the Thought Bomb, a technique that would annihilate everything in its radius, both Jedi and Sith. It was supposed to be their last act of defiance, their scorched earth strategy. But it wasn't Khan's idea, it was Bane's. The Brotherhood, desperate and misled, activated the bomb. They all perished, their spirits trapped in a swirling vortex of eternal torment. Hundreds of Jedi and Sith were instantly destroyed. And Bane? He wasn't even there. He had left, having orchestrated the massacre without lifting a finger. All of the Sith were gone, except for him. In one move, he had wiped the slate clean. This was the true beginning of the Sith, as we would later know them. Not as a cult of thousands, constantly bickering and backstabbing, but as a hidden lineage, one master, one apprentice. Bane had concluded that the dark side was too powerful to be shared. If too many wielded it, they'd always destroy each other before defeating the Jedi. But if it was passed down slowly, deliberately, from one generation to the next, each Sith would grow stronger than the last, until one day they would strike. This idea became the foundation of what he called the Rule of Two. Two there should be, no more, no less. One to embody power, the other to crave it. It was cruel but elegant, dangerous but sustainable. The Sith would go underground, retreat from the galaxy's eyes, and wait. They would infiltrate, manipulate, and scheme, not through open warfare, but through politics, economics, and fear. The Jedi, thinking them extinct, would grow complacent, and the Sith, now in the shadows, would grow patient. But of course, Bane needed an apprentice, someone worthy, someone capable of continuing his vision without failing, as the Brotherhood had. That apprentice was a young girl named Zannah. Zannah was not merely ambitious or powerful, she was cunning, patient, and profoundly disciplined. Found among the war-torn ruins of Ruusan, she was already marked by the dark side's touch, ruthless and unyielding. From the moment she began training, Zannah's relationship with Bane was a complex dance of mentorship, mistrust, and power struggle. Bane understood well that the Rule of Two demanded the apprentice eventually kill the master. This harsh reality shaped their bond, fueling constant tests of strength, skill, and will. Zannah grew not only in raw power, but in subtlety and strategy, learning that the Sith's greatest weapon was patience. One of Zannah's defining traits was her mastery of Sith sorcery, ancient and secretive dark side arts. Sith sorcery allowed her to bend reality itself, conjure illusions so convincing they could shatter minds, and even manipulate life and death in ways that terrified friend and foe alike. Unlike her predecessor's direct approach, Zannah was a master of shadows, thriving on deception and manipulation. This mastery extended beyond combat. Zannah traveled the galaxy in disguise, slipping into the folds of political and criminal networks, planting seeds of corruption and influence that would grow slowly, hidden from Jedi scrutiny. Through careful manipulation and patient planning, she ensured that the Sith's reach extended far beyond the battlefield. After years of preparation, the inevitable moment came. Zannah challenged Darth Bane in a deadly duel that tested every lesson she had learned and every ounce of her growing strength. Their fight was not a simple battle of weapons, but a clash of minds and wills, of dark side power sharpened by years of secrecy and cunning. When Zannah emerged victorious, she fulfilled the Rule of Two's grim promise. The apprentice who could surpass the master would claim the mantle of Dark Lord. With Bane's death, Zannah became the new master, charged with carrying the Sith legacy forward. She upheld the Rule of Two, continuing the cycle of mentorship and deadly challenge. Under her watch, the Sith refined their approach further, emphasizing secrecy and patience even more. Open wars gave way to shadow wars, battles fought in the corridors of power, in whispered conspiracies and subtle manipulations. Over the following centuries, the Rule of Two dictated the Sith's every move. Masters and apprentices worked in secret, carefully avoiding detection by the Jedi and the Republic. The Sith became experts in long-term planning, infiltration, and subtle corruption. This long game shaped the fate of the galaxy. The Sith patiently manipulated political systems, engineered conflicts, and infiltrated the Republic's highest ranks. They waited for the Jedi to grow complacent, for divisions to arise, and for the perfect moment to strike. Their influence reached far and wide, shaping the course of history without ever revealing their true presence. Zannah's own fate became shrouded in mystery. Some legends say she continued to train apprentices in secret, guiding the Sith's survival from the shadows. Others believe she vanished quietly, her legacy preserved only through the Rule of Two and the apprentices who followed. Whatever the truth, her impact was undeniable. She was the first to prove that Bane's vision could endure, that the Sith could survive not by brute force but by patience, cunning, and secrecy. The Rule of Two's influence echoed through the ages, culminating in Sith Lords like Darth Sidious, who spent decades weaving an intricate web of manipulation that ultimately brought down the Republic and nearly destroyed the Jedi Order. The patient, shadowy approach pioneered by Bane and perfected by Zannah enabled the Sith to become an unstoppable force. In the end, the Sith were no longer a chaotic horde, but a refined lineage of power and patience. Their strength lay in their shadows, their patience, and their ruthless will to survive. Through the rule of two, Darth Bane and Darth Zana forged a legacy that would haunt the galaxy for millennia, a quiet but deadly storm waiting for the moment to consume everything in darkness. After the cataclysm that ended the Brotherhood of Darkness, the galaxy entered what many historians call the Age of Peace. The Republic stabilized. The Jedi believed the Sith were finally gone for good. For 1,000 years, there was no open war, no grand invasions, no fiery lightsaber duels in the Senate Rotunda. The Sith disappeared completely from the public eye, but they weren't gone. They were just quiet. Following Darth Bane's rule of two, one master, one apprentice, the Sith began their long game. This was not a short-term strategy. It was a multi-generational plan that required patience, discipline, and the complete rejection of the chaotic, backstabbing ways that had brought the old Sith to ruin. From this point forward, the Sith wouldn't operate as a military order or political movement. They would become a hidden thread, slowly weaving their way back into galactic power without anyone noticing. Each Sith generation followed the same structure. One master would train one apprentice. The master would pass on everything they had learned. The apprentice's final test was not just to survive, but to grow strong enough to kill the master and take their place. That was the cycle. These pairs lived in the shadows of the galaxy, often posing as nobles, merchants, advisors, or scholars. Some embedded themselves in planetary politics. Others simply observed, gathering knowledge. Each generation added a little more to the plan. Over time, the Sith learned to specialize in areas the Jedi didn't fully understand or didn't want to touch. Espionage, infiltration, economic manipulation, political games, all things that could topple governments without firing a shot. Sith Lords became masters of subtlety. They funded wars from the shadows, influenced elections, and built criminal empires to extend their reach. You wouldn't know they were there, but their fingerprints were on everything. Many of these Sith remained completely unknown to history. They didn't wear robes, didn't draw lightsabers in public, and never revealed their identities. Their legacy exists only in whispers, passed down through Sith holocrons and encrypted records. But make no mistake, they were there, in the background, watching everything. This period of silence wasn't without danger though. With only 2 Sith alive at any given time, the survival of the entire order depended on discipline. A mistake, a moment of arrogance, or an act of carelessness could expose both the master and apprentice. There were close calls, rumors of dark side users would occasionally surface, and the Jedi would investigate. But every time the Sith covered their tracks. Sometimes the apprentice had to be sacrificed. Sometimes the master disappeared and left the next Sith to carry on alone. But the line never broke. Centuries passed like this. Sith pairs came and went, each one contributing a piece to a much larger puzzle. One might focus on collecting ancient Jedi knowledge. Another might build networks in the Outer Rim. Another might plant seeds of corruption in the Republic's core. Slowly, the pieces began to fit together. The Jedi, in their confidence, didn't notice the rot. The Republic grew larger, but also more bloated, more inefficient, and more vulnerable. By the time the galaxy reached the final decades of the Republic, the Sith had already built a foundation beneath it. They had allies in the Senate, connections in trade guilds, and agents in the criminal underworld. They understood the weaknesses of the Republic better than the senators did, and they knew how to exploit every one of them. The beauty of the Sith plan was that it didn't rely on brute strength, it relied on patience. The Sith weren't interested in storming the Jedi Temple with sabers blazing. They were interested in getting the Jedi to destroy themselves, politically, spiritually, and morally. And that process had already started. In public, the Jedi still acted as guardians of peace and justice, but behind closed doors, they were stretched thin. The galaxy was changing, and the Jedi weren't adapting fast enough. They were bogged down in diplomacy, bureaucracy, and politics. The Sith didn't need to attack them directly. They just had to keep applying pressure in the right places and wait for the cracks to spread. Each new Sith Master took what their predecessor had built and pushed it a little further. Some apprentices failed, some betrayed the mission or tried to seize power too early. But the line held, and eventually that long silence paid off. Born into a wealthy aristocratic family, he grew up surrounded by privilege, influence, and the polished culture of a world far removed from war. His background gave him access to fine education, social prestige, and the attention of powerful political figures. But more than anything, it taught him how power operated in quiet spaces, how people in high places often said one thing and meant another. From a young age, Palpatine paid attention to these contradictions and learned how to use them. He was intelligent, restrained, and perceptive. Teachers and politicians alike saw him as promising. He understood decorum, tradition, and ambition, but he lacked any signs of empathy. What he didn't display emotionally, he made up for in cold focus. This wasn't someone who made noise in a room, but someone who listened carefully, remembered everything, and stored it for later use. It was this quality, subtle but sharp, that drew the interest of Darth Plagueis. At the time, Plagueis was operating quietly, behind the scenes, already a master of Sith manipulation, more concerned with long-term planning than brute strength. He was searching for a patient, capable successor, someone who could work in the shadows, influence politics, and understand the deeper mechanisms of power. In Palpatine, he saw exactly that. Plagueis did not reveal himself immediately. Instead, he observed. Palpatine, in turn, sensed that he was being watched. And when the moment came, when Plagueis finally unveiled his identity as a Sith Lord, Palpatine did not flinch. He listened. Plagueis began training him in Sith philosophy, teaching the rule of two. Sidious learned that the Sith did not thrive through chaos and spectacle, but through patience, secrecy, and manipulation. Power wasn't taken. It was cultivated, grown from within systems, and then redirected. Plagueis believed in subtlety. He saw the Sith's future not in open warfare, but in economic leverage, political influence, and systemic decay of the Republic from the inside. He wasn't wrong, but Sidious was never fully aligned with his master's vision. He played the role of a student, asked the right questions, offered the right flattery, followed instructions carefully, but always with his own intentions growing in the background. While Plagueis became obsessed with immortality and biological research, Sidious turned his attention toward the Republic. He began embedding himself in Naboo's political infrastructure. As a senator, he rose through the ranks with a calm, diplomatic persona, unassuming, agreeable, and courteous. To most in the Senate, he was an example of Naboo's refinement. Behind that surface, though, he was studying the flaws in the system, mapping its weaknesses, and establishing connections that would later become tools. He built alliances with trade guilds, business leaders, and disillusioned senators. Everything he supported publicly had a long-term reason. Every delay in the Senate, every loophole in law, every growing frustration among the systems of the Republic, all of it served his plan. He watched how bureaucracy failed, how fear spread faster than truth, and how easily the Jedi could be caught in endless discussions while real change happened elsewhere. Plagueis encouraged this direction. In fact, much of it was part of his own vision. He imagined a galaxy where the Sith ruled not by fear, but by influence. He believed that, by controlling the economy and corrupting the Senate, they could collapse the Republic quietly and replace it without war. Sidious listened, agreed, and appeared to cooperate. But by this point, he had already begun making decisions on his own. He started keeping information from Plagueis, nothing obvious, small pieces of intelligence, new alliances, financial movements, conversations with future allies. Plagueis was brilliant, but deeply focused on his own immortality research. He spent long hours studying midichlorian manipulation and biological experiments, believing that if he could conquer death, the Sith would no longer need to pass knowledge through dangerous apprenticeships. Sidious nodded and listened, but had no interest in eternal partnership. While Plagueis was buried in his labs, Sidious began reaching out to others, small steps at first, then more confident moves. He made contact with systems dissatisfied with the Republic, began whispering to potential warlords, and continued building relationships with influential industrialists. These were the early pieces of what would become the Separatist crisis, long before anyone knew the name Count Dooku. Even within his master's circle, Sidious began to cultivate personal loyalty. Some followers of Plagueis found themselves answering more to Sidious than to the one who had trained them all. It wasn't rebellion, it was restructuring. Plagueis still thought he was leading the plan. Sidious simply adjusted the details. Through it all, Sidious never appeared rushed or reckless. He never argued with Plagueis. He never challenged him directly. He simply kept moving. Every day, more contacts, more influence, more knowledge of how to take apart the Republic, quietly, piece by piece. At some point, Sidious stopped being the apprentice in practice, even though the official title remained. His vision for the future diverged sharply from his master's, but he never said it out loud. He didn't need to. All he needed was the right moment. One final quiet transition where student replaced teacher. He trusted his apprentice completely, and that was the mistake. While Plagueis locked himself away with ancient texts and rituals, Sidious was busy. Quietly, methodically, he was building something of his own. He didn't confront Plagueis, didn't challenge him openly, didn't argue or disobey. He simply expanded. He began forming alliances that had nothing to do with his master's plans. He contacted the Trade Federation, offered favors to Neimoidian leaders, started feeding resources into droid armies. He worked with criminal syndicates and blackmailed senators. Every deal made the Republic a little weaker. Every ally strengthened his future war effort. And then there was Maul. Plagueis didn't know, or perhaps he didn't care. Either way, Sidious trained Maul in secret. From a young age, the Zabrak child was shaped into a weapon. Not a political schemer like his master, but a blade. Pure aggression, fast, loyal, deadly. Maul was never meant to rule. He was meant to strike. When Plagueis talked about the next step, Sidious was already on it, and he wasn't planning to bring anyone with him. The closer Plagueis came to unlocking his theories of immortality, the more he faded from the present. He believed Sidious still worked beneath him, that they would share power, that the galaxy would be theirs to rule together. He didn't see what was coming. The end was simple. A quiet evening, alone in his home on Coruscant, drunk on success, proud of the apprentice who had just been appointed Supreme Chancellor. Plagueis believed the final phase of their plan had begun. Eventually he slept. That's when Sidious killed him. He just let him slip into unconsciousness and kept pouring Force energy into his body until it stopped working. A death by suffocation, made slow and deliberate through the Force. Cold, calculated, silent. Not a shred of mercy. Plagueis the Wise, master of life and death, died without a word. Now he was the master. He didn't need the old Sith Order anymore. He didn't want it. He believed the Sith had failed because they kept looking backward, honouring ancient rules, worrying about legacy. He wanted something different, a new kind of Sith Empire, where the dark side ruled not from temples or thrones, but from inside the systems of the galaxy itself. The Senate would become his puppet show. The Jedi would destroy themselves. The Clone Wars would burn away the last pieces of order, and when the galaxy was weak enough, he would rise. Sidious kept Maul close for a time, let the galaxy focus on him, a red-faced assassin who played the role of apprentice well enough to distract from the real plan. Meanwhile, Sidious made appointments, whispered in the ears of senators, worked late nights in his office. No one suspected him. No one even knew what to look for. Behind closed doors, he gave orders to corporations, altered Senate votes, and funneled resources into armies that officially didn't exist. He met with Count Dooku, an old Jedi with his own frustrations. Plagueis would have disapproved of that alliance, but Plagueis was gone. As Chancellor Palpatine, he became the trusted leader of the Republic. As Darth Sidious, he became the most dangerous Sith Lord in galactic history. The pieces were falling into place. The Jedi were stretched thin. The Republic was bloated and complacent. The war would soon begin. Sidious wouldn't have to fight it. Others would do that for him. He would simply let it unfold. Guide it. Watch the Jedi turn from peacekeepers to soldiers. Watch the clones march. Watch the galaxy burn. And when the flames died down, only one voice would remain. There was never a moment during the Clone Wars where anything was left to chance. Not for the Sith, anyway. While the galaxy thought it was being torn apart by a tragic civil war, in truth, every single battle, every shift in allegiance, every new front, it was all designed, carefully, decades in advance. And at the centre of it all was Darth Sidious. When Count Dooku stepped into the role of political leader of the Separatist Alliance, most didn't even recognise the name. Just another charismatic, silver-haired noble, stirring discontent. But those who looked deeper saw that he wasn't some disgruntled politician. He was a Jedi Master, a respected one. He had walked away from the Order, claiming corruption and decay, and to be fair, he wasn't completely wrong. But what he didn't say, and what no one outside a very small circle knew, was that he was no longer Count Dooku. He was now Darth Tyrannus. By the time the Clone Wars officially began, Sidious had been working with Dooku for years, and the plan was brilliant in its simplicity. You start a war, you control both sides, you force the Jedi to become generals, commanders, and soldiers. You stretch them thin, force them to fight instead of meditate, react instead of reflect. Bit by bit, you erode what they are, until they're too busy fighting to notice the web closing in. The Separatist Alliance wasn't made up of idealists or freedom fighters. It was a patchwork of corporations, greedy Trade Federation leaders, shady banking clans, and planetary systems tired of the Republic's corruption. But all of them had been nudged, encouraged, or threatened into position. Dooku made promises, manipulated fears, and gave them a banner to rally under. While on the other side, Sidious, still masquerading as Senator, then Chancellor Palpatine, pretended to resist. Meanwhile, the Jedi were caught completely off guard. For generations, they had believed the Sith were extinct. They didn't even recognize that Dooku had fallen to the dark side, even when he openly dueled Jedi Masters. That's how far from the truth they had drifted. So when the Clone Wars began, they didn't see it for what it was, a trap. And then there were the clones. The Grand Army of the Republic didn't appear overnight by coincidence. The clone army wasn't even Sidious's idea. It started with Jedi Master Sifo Dyas, a man who saw a war coming before anyone else did. The Jedi Council didn't believe him, so he went behind their backs. Quietly, he commissioned the Kaminoans to begin building a secret army. That's when Sidious stepped in. He had Sifo Dyas eliminated. Then Count Dooku took over the project, posing as Tyrannus and recruiting Jango Fett to serve as the genetic template. From that moment on, the Sith controlled the entire operation, and no one realized it, not the Kaminoans, not the Senate, not even the Jedi. During the war, Sidious maintained two masks. As Chancellor Palpatine, he championed the Republic, rallied senators, and slowly gathered more emergency powers, just until the crisis is over. As Darth Sidious, he guided Dooku's moves, choosing where battles would erupt and when, which Jedi would be sent to which planets, and how to keep the war going just long enough to exhaust everyone involved. The Jedi Council had no idea they were fighting a ghost. Their efforts felt meaningful, even noble. But every victory only served to justify more war. Every loss furthered the Chancellor's power. And slowly, the Jedi found themselves in unfamiliar territory, fighting on worlds they didn't know, commanding troops they didn't trust, and doing so under a government they barely recognized anymore. Some Jedi began to sense something was wrong. Yoda felt it. Windu grew increasingly suspicious of Palpatine's growing influence. But by then, it was already too late. Dooku had played his part to perfection. His role was not to win the war, it was to sustain it, to give the Jedi just enough resistance to keep them engaged, while Sidious laid the final pieces of his puzzle. And behind all of it was the rule of two. Sidious used Dooku, knowing he would one day discard him, and Dooku, for all his strength and pride, never saw it coming. He thought he would help shape a new order, a cleaner galaxy, free of corruption. In the end, he was just another step on Sidious's ladder. The war also created an endless stream of Jedi casualties. Battle after battle chipped away at the Order's numbers, and those who survived came back changed. War wasn't what they were meant for, and that dissonance, the way their ideals clashed with their orders, it wore on them. The darkness grew stronger. By the midpoint of the Clone Wars, Sidious had what he wanted: an obedient military, a weakened Jedi Order, a panicked, divided Republic, and a people ready to accept whatever strong hand promised them peace. For years, the Jedi had been walking a path toward their own extinction, and most of them didn't even know it. The Clone Wars had dragged the Order into the heart of politics, conflict, and command. They weren't peacekeepers anymore. They were generals, decision-makers, leaders of armies, and they were surrounded by troops they hadn't even created. The clone army had been accepted under pressure. It had been waiting, conveniently ready, in the shadows of Kamino. Very few Jedi questioned it. Even fewer looked into its origins. And even when they learned about Sifo Dyas, the war was already too far gone. They were too deep, too invested, and all the while, Darth Sidious was orchestrating everything from both sides. The Jedi were spread thin across thousands of star systems. Their council was overwhelmed, their senses clouded, and their connection to the Force was slowly deteriorating. At the center of it all stood Anakin Skywalker, the chosen one, the one who was meant to bring balance. But balance was never defined clearly, and no one truly understood what it meant. Anakin had been raised as a Jedi, but never felt entirely like one. His loyalty to the Order was real, but complicated. He loved deeply, feared loss intensely, and struggled with the Jedi teachings that told him to let go of everything he cared about, especially Padme. When Anakin began to have visions of Padme dying, he panicked. And when Chancellor Palpatine offered him forbidden knowledge, a way to save her through the dark side, it wasn't a temptation, it was a lifeline. Palpatine didn't rush him. He didn't demand. He waited, slowly revealing his true identity. And when the moment came, Anakin didn't turn against the Sith. He turned them in. Conflicted, torn between fear and duty, Anakin Skywalker revealed to Mace Windu that Palpatine was the Sith Lord, but Windu went to confront him without the Council's full approval. The encounter spiraled. Sidious attacked. Windu gained the upper hand, and Anakin, watching both sides struggle for control, made his final choice. He cut off Windu's hand, allowing Sidious to strike the killing blow. That single moment changed galactic history, and Anakin Skywalker was no more. In his place stood Darth Vader. The Republic was already on edge. Fear of treason and Jedi interference had been quietly stirred for years. All it took was one order. Sidious activated the final piece of his plan. The clone troopers, wired through implanted behavioral protocols, turned on their Jedi generals. Across the galaxy, in outposts, on battlefields, and aboard cruisers, Jedi were shot down by the soldiers they had fought beside for years. Most never had time to ignite their lightsabers. It was sudden, clean, and brutal. The Jedi Temple on Coruscant fell shortly after. Darth Vader led the 501st Legion through its gates, slaughtering the defenders inside. Even the younglings were not spared. The Jedi Order was officially declared traitorous. Sidious framed the events as an attempted coup. The Senate, full of fear and confusion, applauded when Palpatine announced the birth of a new regime, the Galactic Empire. They believed they were choosing safety. What they chose was control. And so, the Jedi were wiped from the stars. Sidious sat upon the Imperial throne. Vader stood at his side. The galaxy was his, and no one truly understood how carefully he had planned it. Palpatine, now Emperor, had simply removed his mask. He no longer needed the careful performance of the kindly Chancellor. He had rewritten the rules and declared himself their author. And by his side stood his most terrifying creation, Darth Vader. Vader wasn't a figurehead, he was a consequence. He existed to make sure every planetary governor, every Moff, every military officer, and every citizen of the Empire knew exactly what resistance would cost them. His presence wasn't feared, it was studied. Stories about him spread faster than official orders. Whole systems surrendered, simply because a Star Destroyer appeared with Vader aboard. Together, Vader and Sidious ruled through fear, manipulation, and silence. In the public eye, the Jedi had been traitors, destroyed by the heroic clone troopers and their brave Emperor. But beneath the surface, Sidious knew the truth. A spark could still be hiding somewhere, and sparks had to be crushed before they became fire. So, a new project began. With the Jedi wiped out, there came the question of leftovers. Force-sensitive children, monks, scholars, even civilians, who might still carry the teachings of the old order. Sidious didn't want to merely wipe out the Jedi. He wanted to end the idea of the Jedi. That meant hunting every last trace of them down, piece by piece. While Vader was the face of punishment, the Inquisitors were the quiet blades in the dark. Former Jedi, twisted by pain, fear, and relentless conditioning, were turned into hunters. They weren't Sith. Sidious never allowed more than 2, but they were still deadly. And, in a cruel irony, many of them had once fought for the light. Now, they were sent to kill what remained of it. Vader oversaw their training. The Inquisitors feared Vader as much as they hated him. He pushed them beyond their limits, breaking them down until they were little more than tools. He didn't want companions. He didn't want equals, he wanted silence, compliance, pain. And yet, despite this complete grip on the galaxy, Sidious was still not satisfied. You see, for all his manipulation and grand vision, there was one thing he still hadn't solved: death. It had been the obsession of his old master, the belief that through the Force one could unlock immortality. That if they just looked deep enough, studied hard enough, controlled enough variables, they could stop the decay of the body, or at least transfer their essence into something that wouldn't die. Plagueis died before he could figure it out. Sidious didn't plan to make the same mistake. So while the Inquisitors hunted Jedi and Vader crushed rebellion, Sidious devoted his time to something quieter: experiments across secret laboratories and hidden moons, cloning projects, rituals, dark alchemy, Sith sorcery that had been banned for millennia. He had scientists working under code names, researching things the galaxy wasn't even supposed to know existed. Vader knew, but Sidious kept him out of most of it. That was the nature of their relationship. Trust was never part of the deal. Vader served because he had no other option, because Sidious had broken him, chained him in machinery, and made him believe there was nothing left but rage. But even as Vader did his master's bidding, a part of him remembered, a part of him wondered what would happen if he broke free. And so the years passed. The Empire expanded, the old systems were swallowed, billions cheered for their peace, whole cultures were rewritten, and all the while, Sidious planned. He believed the Sith should never die again. Not like before, he wanted more than domination, he wanted permanence, so he began creating contingencies. Vaults, codes, clone hosts, Sith cultists sworn to protect his secrets even after death. Operation Cinder, the final order. The idea was simple: even if he fell, he would return, over and over again, until the galaxy was shaped entirely in his image. But even in this grand vision, there were cracks. Vader, for all his loyalty, was never fully tamed, and Sidious knew it. The bond between them wasn't like the one Sidious had with Maul, or even with Dooku. Vader was powerful, more than anyone alive, but he was also dangerous, haunted, and perhaps worst of all, he still had a past. Still, for nearly 2 decades, the plan held. The galaxy forgot what freedom had felt like. Children were raised knowing only the Empire. Propaganda painted the past as chaos and the Jedi as liars, and few dared to speak against it, but even the strongest empires have expiration dates. By the time Luke Skywalker reached adulthood, the Jedi were no longer a memory. They were a myth. The Temple had been destroyed decades earlier. The clones were gone, the Republic was history, and the Empire ruled every corner of the galaxy with fear and efficiency. Darth Sidious remained hidden behind the name Emperor Palpatine. Darth Vader had become the faceless executioner of Imperial will. The name Anakin Skywalker was never spoken. No one even knew it existed, but the story wasn't finished. As the rebellion grew, so did whispers of the Jedi, through a young farm boy from Tatooine who barely knew what the Force was. When Vader first encountered Luke, he saw potential. Anakin Skywalker had a son, and that changed everything. For the first time in decades, the Sith were no longer just dealing with political power or hidden enemies. They were dealing with family. The Emperor was fascinated. He saw the opportunity to replace Vader, to mold someone younger, stronger, untouched by injury or history. Sidious planned to twist Luke, just as he had once twisted Anakin. And Vader quietly allowed it. But things weren't so simple anymore. The more time Vader spent near Luke, the more cracks began to appear in the armor. Luke spoke to him not as an enemy, but as a son. He didn't hate Vader, he believed in Anakin. And Vader, for all his darkness, started to listen. Luke's refusal to kill his father during their final duel aboard the second Death Star wasn't an act of weakness. It was defiance, not against the dark side, but against the endless cycle of control and fear that Sidious had built. Luke threw away his weapon and accepted death rather than join him. And that moment revealed something Sidious hadn't prepared for. Anakin Skywalker still existed, buried beneath armor, silence, and decades of pain, but still alive. When Sidious attacked Luke with Force lightning, mocking him, laughing, torturing him in front of Vader, and in that moment, Anakin Skywalker returned. Vader lifted the Emperor in both arms and hurled him into the reactor core, sacrificing his own life to end Sidious once and for all. Anakin died as a Jedi. The Jedi Order didn't return in that moment. The Republic didn't come back overnight. But the chain of darkness that had stretched for generations, from Bane to Plagueis to Sidious, finally snapped. The Empire began to collapse soon after. The rebels won, the Death Star was destroyed, the galaxy was no longer ruled by shadows, and in the end the Sith were gone, and the Jedi had returned. It's tempting to say the Sith were just evil, and it's true, many of them did monstrous things, but if we reduce them to that word, evil, we miss something more complicated, because not every Sith wanted the same thing. Some of them genuinely thought they were saving the galaxy, others were in it for power. Some just wanted revenge, some were philosophers, others were warlords, and a few were just tired of being told no. Let's start with the most common thread, domination. The Sith believed in control. They believed that chaos was the natural state of the galaxy, and that peace was a lie, a momentary illusion forced by institutions like the Jedi and the Republic. To the Sith, there was no such thing as balance. There was only power, and those who had the will to take it. They didn't see themselves as villains. They saw themselves as liberators from weakness. They believed that through domination, they could impose order. But not all Sith were galactic conquerors. Some of them, especially the ancient ones, were after something far more personal, immortality. Darth Plagueis experimented with midichlorians, not to build an army, but to stop death itself. It was their obsession with immortality that drove them to become monsters. Spirits locked in tombs, husks of themselves, feeding off life, unable to let go. The Sith craved permanence in a galaxy that kept moving without them. And behind it all, there was something even more human: freedom. You don't hear that word often when talking about the Sith, but many of them believed they were freeing themselves from tradition, from servitude, from chains. The Sith code begins with that idea: peace is a lie, there is only passion. Through passion, I gain strength. Through strength, I gain power. Through power, I gain victory. Through victory, my chains are broken. That final line, my chains are broken, is what the Sith believed made them different from the Jedi. The Jedi were calm, disciplined, humble, but to the Sith that wasn't peace, it was slavery. The Sith wanted to feel everything: anger, desire, ambition, loss, rage, ecstasy, victory. They didn't want to control their emotions, they wanted to use them, because emotions to them were not weaknesses. They were the source of all power. If the Jedi taught detachment, the Sith preached freedom. It's why so many Jedi fell. They didn't always fall for power. Sometimes they fell because they were tired of pretending to be empty, because they loved someone, because they hated what the war turned them into. And that's the truth about the Sith.